Samin Nosrat's 2017 cookbook debut, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, was a bestseller that taught cooks of all skill levels the building blocks of flavor and texture, including myself. But after her massive success that included a James Beard Award and a Netflix documentary, Nosrat was diagnosed with clinical depression and said the joy she once found with cooking stopped being attainable. It was cooking for community and for her found family that brought her back. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, Samin joins us in studio. Her new book is called Good Things, Recipes and Rituals to Share with People You Love. Samin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So your new book, bit of a departure from Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, and for those who are not familiar with it, there you really encourage people to embrace the idea of not needing a structured recipe per se, and that any ingredient can make a delicious meal. So tell our listeners more about, what was happening in your life in between then when you started thinking about what you wanted next for your new book.
So I published the book, which was so successful, and then we turned it into a documentary series for Netflix, which was also just like, Netflix is in 220 countries, so it went out to the whole world. Mm-hmm. And I was just sort of responded to with so much love and praise and acclaim and positivity, which is wonderful. And really, in so many ways, all I ever dreamt of. My parents are immigrants from Iran. I was born and grew up in California. I very much sort of was like a very typical child of immigrants, sort of striving to achieve and be recognized for my achievements. And so here I was achieving and being recognized for like the very biggest things in my field beyond what I ever could have dreamt of. And that felt really great. And also it was really destabilizing and a little bit confusing. And, once I had some quiet after like almost 3 straight years of sort of working, putting things out and traveling, I started to realize that the thing that had been driving me, I think on some level, I believed if I did reach those heights, I would feel okay. I would finally feel full and complete and happy, and like this sort of sadness in my heart would be resolved and addressed, And I always say like loneliness is my oldest friend. Like there has just been a sense of loneliness in the core of my heart since I was a little kid. And here I was in the aftermath of all this attention, and I was still lonely. And I kind of was really disappointed to realize like all of this work that I'd done hadn't resolved this issue. And it's not to say that I believed it consciously that it would solve it. It was just sort of unnerving to realize I was still where there I was, still where I always was. And that was really kind of, it picked me up and uprooted me from what little sort of grounding I had in my life, because then I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Always I had been like, achieve, and I did do that, and it didn't solve anything. And then alongside that, I had now this assignment to write a new book. And I'm not an actor. I'm not very good at faking things. So the joy and sort of passion that I express about cooking, both in my writing and on the show, is all very genuine and authentic. But it's also just one part of who I am. And so what had happened in a big way was I think I became an avatar of joy for people. They really assigned this to me, and I felt a pressure to perform that. And here I was with the job to write another book, but I didn't feel any joy. And I certainly didn't feel any joy around food. And so I had to find my way back to, if not joy, then at least a sense of meaning of why I was doing this, because I didn't have a why. And so the book in a lot of ways is a story and a documentation of how I got there.
Well, and I wonder if that process that you're still going through, I imagine a lot of unpacking along the way, is a mixture of, I think we get caught in I achieved this one thing. all I have to do is get to the next thing, then I will really be happy. And so you have that expectation on top of the nuance of being a child of immigrants. I think growing up in certain communities, perhaps that can be isolating already, right? And whether or not you knew it, I think as a child, I feel like as a fellow child of immigrants, I feel like a lot of us experience that journey as children, but not realizing the layers of it until you're an adult. And then on top of all of that, you have the added complication of exposing yourself to the public. And I wonder if it's a mix of all three of those, and sprinkle on top of that. Perhaps we as the audience forget that you are a human being and that you have multitudes. You have joy, you have sadness, you have anger, you have happiness.
Totally. I think that's exactly right. It's all of those things. And there's definitely the parasocial relationship as part of it, which I remember at times, like I would get so mad about, I'd be like, they just want me to be happy, but I'm not happy. And I just want to wear my pajamas and order a coffee at the coffee shop and be a grumpy lady, but I'm not allowed to.
Goals, actually.
And definitely I think there is so much that I think all children, no matter who we are, we only are surviving and existing in the family that we have because that's all we know. So it's not until you grow up and go out into the world that you can start to contextualize like your own experience and unpack it. So that for me has been a long sort of process that I'll be doing until, as long as I'm here. Right. And, but I definitely think, yes, it's a multi-layered thing. And I was for my whole life caught up in the what's the next thing I can achieve? What's the next thing I can achieve? I think this in a way was a gift to get such a huge sort of achievement and maybe if that hadn't happened, I'd still be doing it. And it's not to say I have had some I've seen the light and I'm no longer ambitious. Of course I have goals. Of course I have things I would like to accomplish. I think they're just not the main driver of my life, at least right now, and hopefully never again. Because I think the thing I realized I was missing was a sense of belonging. And I've always kind of lacked that, but it felt so stark in that moment, partly because it was very highlighted by the fact that now a pandemic was settling in around me, and I was literally alone in my house.
Right.
And so that was very much, it highlighted the loneliness because it was inescapable. Yeah.
Well, and I want to come back to when you did find community and a found family, but in between during the process, you've been very open and written and talked about not only your depression, but also going through grief. And you've lost several people in your life in a very short period of time. Can you tell us more about that experience and how that informs you?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, the first sort of wave of grief wasn't about a recent death. It was like a very belated realization, a 40-year belated realization about the loss of my sister, who when my mom was pregnant with me, I had an older sister who was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And so I was born sort of into this already pre-grieving family. And my sister died when I was a year and a half old. And in our culture, in my family, maybe just at the time, the norm very much was like not to assign any psychological humanity to me as an 18-month-old. Right. I think it was very much like my mother's loss in our family. And so I knew I had a sister. That fact was not hidden from me, but there wasn't really like any opportunity or space given to me as a human to grieve that or to have any emotions around that. And so I've always kind of been very matter of fact, like, oh yeah, I had a sister, but she died. That's kind of the way that I would talk about it. And in probably 2021, I was reading a draft of my friend Laurel Braitman's memoir, and she lost many she's just had the sort of loss after loss in her book, and it was very much about grief. And after reading sort of about the series of profound losses in her life, I felt so moved, and there was something very familiar to me in this book. And I remember thinking to myself, like, this is weird. Like, what about this is familiar to me? Like, I've never lost anything. And it took me a few weeks before it occurred to me, like, oh, maybe this feeling of loss is actually about my sister. And again, also simultaneously, this thing happened that was so beautiful and profound, which is I live in this little community of 4 homes built around like a central courtyard. And we have neighbors ranging in ages from like, I don't know, 6 to 80 right now, like multi-generational. And so at the time, our youngest was 1.5. And in the mornings, he would come knock on my door and say hi to me and say hi to my puppy dog, Fava. And he was just like so vibrant and alive. And he was not incredibly verbal, but there was a whole person there, you know, like a whole personality and a whole person. And so over time, I realized like, oh my gosh, like Nico's the age I was when my sister died. And if his older sister, who he loves and worships, were to disappear tomorrow, then and nobody ever talked about it again, then of course he would be bereft and have this like deep sense of loss inside of him that would be inexplicable to him for the rest of his life. So I think by seeing someone the same age, I was able to have compassion for myself. And so that set me off on a multi-year journey of really processing and getting to know this grief, getting to know my sister, and understanding what like her presence and her loss meant for me in my life, in our family. And because in my family and our culture, there's so much that's left unsaid for a lot of complicated reasons. Like sometimes just information is just willfully kept from me. I didn't have an opportunity to ask too many family members for stories or for information. So I threw myself into sort of a journalistic approach. And I started reading like studies about what happens to a sibling when their older sibling dies, what happens to a family system. I did multiple types of therapy to try and sort of resolve or process this. And that was really sort of the first step of my grieving. And then just when I was sort of resettling after that, then my dad, who I was estranged from pretty much my whole adult life, he had a traumatic brain injury and ended up on a ventilator, likely to never wake up. And so that was this new level of like chaos and melodrama for me and my brothers in our life. And that took about 6 months for us to sort of advocate for him and care for him and like be with him as he died. And that was its own complication because of course there's a grief in losing a parent. And then also there was a whole level of like complexity and grief and confusion and pain because this relationship with this parent was really complicated and my dad was not, he was not always a safe person to be around. And so it was just so much. And so after this like wave after wave of, loss and grief, I really was left with the clarity of like, oh my gosh, like life is so short, you know? And this idea that's been driving me my whole life of like, put your head down and achieve and be good, because then maybe one day someone will recognize that and reward you and then you can be happy. I was like, oh no, that's flawed. There's a flaw in that. And actually like I have to live my life as much as possible now because I don't know how much time I'm going to have. And so, and sort of as that was sort of occurring to me and I was realizing how valuable time is, I was also finding my way back to cooking and really started to understand cooking as an opportunity to choose how I spend my time, who I spend my time with and for and on, and that this, in fact, that time is the most valuable and precious gift that I can give to anyone.
When I think time is a reoccurring theme for you, right? In terms of how you see it, how you treat it, how you use it, what's given to us, right? Like you mentioned, and I'm glad that you were able to find your way back to cooking. What was it like finding that joy again after losing it for so long?
It was really incremental, I'll say. Like it wasn't, there was not like a...
not like a moment of
there was not a moment.
We all wish
sure.
that happened that way.
Yeah, it was really incremental. And I think a big part of what really served me was narrowing my focus. You know, I think I had gone through this experience that had sort of exposed me and brought me into the whole wide world and introduced me to the whole wide world and sort of given me the idea that I speak to the whole wide world, you know, and which is a little bit flawed. Like, but I, in some ways I had this like false sense of grandiosity. Like everything I say, so many people are going to listen to. And so I sort of realized that was not serving me. And I really narrowed like the aperture of the lens to, I can't think about the whole world. I can think about myself. I can think about my neighbors. I can think about my friends, my community. I sort of was like, I literally gave myself a 3-block radius of my house. And I was like, if I can just sort of make choices in my daily life that affect this 3-block radius positively, like whether it's gardening, collecting my neighbor's fruit, making a cake and bringing a piece of cake back to them,
Right.
you know, like taking care of these, like kids at this school nearby, feeding my friends who live nearby, like that felt doable. And so, in terms of food, again, it was very small. This was still also during the like long, you know, extended lockdown. And so I was gardening a lot. There was a lot of just like being very present in my very local vicinity. And so what can I make out of this maybe not perfectly delicious cucumber that I've grown, but it's here, you know? And so...
And it's yours.
Yeah, and it's mine. And I think maybe I don't need to have the ambition of like making the best food in the world, teaching everyone in the world the best techniques, but like how do I make the most out of this thing that's presented to me, presented itself to me right here? Like an opportunity I have to cook these ingredients in my pantry or just make something nourishing for the people around me.
Well, and I think one of the things that you've been talking about, I feel like I'm threading here, is this idea that perhaps you give to yourself, but maybe in the bigger sense that society gave to you, that you have these, or you need to have these goals, and you have to achieve them to be deemed successful. And I think this was something you said in a 2020 New Yorker interview that really stuck with me. You touched on how you've never had anxiety about age in terms of time. But then you going into the sort of like, but if I focus on my community, because I think part of the quote was, you can't solve world hunger by yourself. And I think that's sort of what we grow up to believing is, oh, you got to save the world, right? You're here to save the world, or whatever that looks like for you. And I think in your case, you mentioned world hunger for obvious reasons. But then you've kind of gotten into the processes of, wait, maybe I can't solve world hunger, but I can feed my neighbors, I can feed my friends. So is that a complete change of philosophy, or is that a new purpose that you found in yourself in your cooking?
Maybe it's a refinement is a good way to think of it. Is like I had maybe like a pretty clunky understanding of like my purpose or the service that I can provide, and that this is a refinement that also includes me as a part of the formula. I think a huge part of what I am trying to say in this book, in a way, in so many different ways, and I think what I'm trying to is actually just something I'm trying to say to myself, which is like, maybe you're already enough. Like maybe you don't have to earn and deserve everything. And so maybe the simple things that we cook, like maybe the things we cook for dinner for ourselves and the people we love, they probably don't have to look like a restaurant meal. You know, like it doesn't have to be glitzy and glamorous to be good and worthy and nourishing. Maybe like the amount of effort or time or energy that you have to give is enough in any given moment. Maybe like the thing that I get to be, you know, I think thinking, having the flawed self-assigned assignment or society-assigned assignment of saving the world or fixing world hunger doesn't actually incorporate me as an element in that. It doesn't incorporate like what I have capacity to do or want to do. And in a way, the idea that by narrowing the view and seeing like, I'm an element in this, what do I have the ability to give, I think is a real growth for me, because I've often just like self-sacrificed to such an extreme degree And that ultimately doesn't serve anyone, because then I hate and I end up being like resentful and hating everyone. So
right. And then turns out it's all like inside.
And nobody actually asked me to do those things.
Right.
I just,
And they're grateful.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because as you were describing your experience, I'm thinking, I studied journalism. I went to journalism school and was surrounded by that. And it's interesting because now I'm thinking back, it's very, you're going to cover stories about the world and your one story is going to change everything. It's like, but that's not the case. Mm-mm. And I don't remember if there was a crushing moment of realizing that, but I do believe the burden can be crushing when you feel like your one story needs to change the world. But thankfully, early on, I think I recognized that, well, if my one story can change one person, or maybe my several stories can touch one person, that will be enough for me. I'm never going to find out, really.
No, and those are the most profound, to me, like that's been reflecting back, the most profound sort of things that make their way back to me are the individual stories. Yesterday, a father brought me like a picture. He printed out like a still of a screenshot of like one of the shows that I was on. I was on a show called Waffles and Mochi with some Muppets and Mrs. Obama. And it was about kids and food. And he printed it out and he said, "Could you sign this for my son who's autistic and has really," and I said, "Oh, is he a good eater?" And he said, "No, actually he has a lot of challenges with eating, but he loves Waffles and Mochi so much because each episode allows him to really focus and deep dive on an ingredient. So then he'll come out of it being like, honey, I want to learn more about honey." And so it's been this amazing changing thing for him. And so when I get to hear like something I did is a positive force in somebody's life in that way, that feels better than, any award, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, and before we go to break, I want to at least get to your dedication page because upon opening your book, that's the first thing we see. And you dedicated it to your found family, the book to your found family. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a little bit twofold. One is, for me, the dedication in the first book, In Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, is to my mother and to Alice Waters, who is sort of like my kitchen mother. Mm-hmm. And so it's for my two moms, And also I've, like they both, I kind of say, are like perfectionist, sort of impossible to please moms. And I think reflective of the journey that I've been through, the list of people and my dog in this dedication, very important, are the sort of the people, and one of them is like my actual brother, but like the people who have chosen to make me part of their family, which feels really profoundly different and very, like I finally, for the first time, have a place where I get to feel like I belong and I'm a part of. And many, but not most of the names on that list are a group of people who I have a weekly dinner ritual with. And that has really been this force that came out of the pandemic, came out of my grief, and sort of none of us planned to make this ritual or to create this group dynamic with each other, but it has become central to our lives. And I'm so, so, so grateful for it.
More with James Beard Award-winning author Samin Nosrat after a short break. You can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Samin Nosrat taught a generation of cooks and food lovers to lean into their intuition. Her book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, helped many understand the building blocks of flavor. Her new book is a departure that inspires the chef in all of us, not only to cook great things, but to share them with the people you love. Today, Samin is with us in studio. So Samin, we've been talking a lot about food and people and how sometimes it's not just about the food, it's about the people as well. And seeing that a lot of people really loved Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat it provided both structure and a lot of inspiration for creativity. And so how did you continue that theme of providing recipes and guidance, but also allowing freedom for your readers?
Do you mean in this, in
Yeah,
the new
in the
book?
new, yeah.
It was definitely a journey to get to this new book. In large part because I initially set out to write another sort of philosophical tome like Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat that would help people sort of navigate the kitchen and decide what to cook at any given time, given a handful of constraints. And once I started to research that, I realized it was such a huge undertaking, and I kind of melted down under the pressure of it. And I said, I can't do this. Take the money back. I can't write this book. It'll take me 20 years. And eventually somebody said, I don't know why you make this so hard for yourself. You know, you always feel like you have to reinvent the genre. You can just write a book of recipes. And I was like, have you even met me? Like, I would never do that. I wrote a whole book teaching you to cook without having to rely on recipes.
Right.
Why would I write a book of recipes? And that feels so sort of constraining to me. And I actually, in some ways, I feel like recipes can be very trapping, both to me as the person who makes them and to you as the person who uses them. And so I have this kind of sense of pressure that I put on myself. If I'm going to give you something to follow to the letter, I want to guarantee that your result is going to be so good.
Actually, did you grow up with recipes?
No.
Okay.
No.
Because I also did not.
Yeah. And so my mom we had one cookbook in our house, which is sort of like the equivalent of the Persian, like Joy of Cooking.
Okay.
That was it. And then, and my mom did not cook from recipes. She basically taught herself how to cook from taste and memory and from calling her mom back in Iran. And I didn't grow up in the kitchen. My mom wanted me to be doing my homework. She did not want me to like end up laboring in a kitchen. And so,
Joke's on you.
And so, and then when I started cooking in a restaurant at Chez Panisse where the menu changes every day, you know, on the one hand, the chefs gave me a stack of cookbooks and they told me to familiarize myself with them as the sort of foundational texts of our kitchen. But that was not what I saw reflected at work. At work, I got to work every day, and cooks sort of knew how to make everything under the sun. And so the chef would present a menu, a completely different menu every day, and say, today we're making this, today we're making that. And then the cooks would be assigned their dish and go make it.
Right.
No matter what it was. And nobody was saying, 4 tablespoons this, 2 tablespoons that, 375.
I'm not going to lie. I did not have any measuring utensils until college. And the only reason why I have measuring cups is to measure my oatmeal.
Oh, I was going to say, was it your rice? Yeah. Yeah.
Close.
Yeah. And so, And so I spent a lot of time figuring out how to sort of communicate what I saw happening in the restaurant kitchen to home cooks, which became Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And so the idea that what's on a single page, if I follow it, will produce the same result for me in California, you in Connecticut, somebody in France, you know, anywhere you are, is kind of, I'm like, that is such a huge and flawed premise. Or that you'll even get the same result time after time, because so many things in our cooking are constantly changing. You know, even the oranges we buy at one time of year versus another time of year taste different. So how can the orange juice even be the same? And multiply that times 1 million ingredients and 1 million steps. And so I don't know if you can tell by this point, but I'm very neurotic and I really overthought this. And I put all this pressure on myself to deliver a very good recipe. And also, the other thing for me is when I'm teaching people how to cook or like trying to guide them, what I want to do is show you how you actually know so much more than you think you know.
Right.
And so if you're learning how to make a stew, you also implicitly know how to make a soup and a braise and all of the different names for all of that in all of the cultures around the world. Because to be totally honest, like there's only a handful of ways that humans have figured out how to cook stuff all around the world. And there's just our sort of like spins that we put on them, you know? Right. And so it's like, I want to connect all those dots for you. So you understand, like today, maybe you're making something from Taiwan, but tomorrow you can use those same techniques to make Mexican food.
Right.
And what I've realized is people don't always want all of that information. It doesn't actually help. And so what's been interesting is in the wake of sort of the show coming out and the book coming out, is so much of the feedback I get is, wow, salt, fat, acid, heat really made me a much better cook. Like it changed the way I look at cooking. But if an equal, if not greater proportion of the feedback is, I just made your chicken, or we make your focaccia once a week at my house, or that lasagna is our special event dish, or this rice means so much to me. And so as I started to see the feedback and understand that like how people were actually interacting with what I had offered was almost always a recipe, I was like, oh, maybe actually the way I can be of the greatest service is by offering recipes, even if I find them sort of innately flawed. But if I can explain what my tension and my friction with them is, maybe that'll be, if nothing else, helpful for me. And then I can choose different structures of recipes to convey, to communicate this information. So for like a more complicated dish that maybe has more steps or is involves baking or precise measurements, recipes in the book tend to look really familiar, and they're a list of ingredients followed by a list of steps to follow. But there's also sort of visual matrices that we created so I can connect a lot of those dots for you. There's some recipes that I write in a sort of a multi-paragraph story about a silly thing that I made once. There are, and then there are just some sort of recipes almost in that joy of cooking format where I love the joy of cooking because they cram so much information into in such little space, but they don't separate out the ingredients list. They just sort of bold ingredients. And so what made sense for any one particular category of cooking is what I sort of used in Good Things. So it isn't actually the same page after page. It's very much like each chapter has its own purpose.
Well, it sounds like it's more storytelling, less like a manual.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And also like I worked really hard with my like very close collaborator, recipe tester, over the course of 5 years to test and retest them to make sure that they would work. So the recipes do work, but I just had to get to a place where I was like proud and comfortable, with what it was that I was putting out.
Well, it sounds like the feedback helped you actually let go of the perfectionism in some way. Because it feels like a mix, like the stew that you're making here.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Is a mix of riffing and perfectionism.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not even, I think also part of my job as a recipe writer, I feel like, is to give you the right amount of information and the right specifics to both feel confident, like I tell you the things that are sort of like non-negotiable, right? But I also sort of do my best to point out the moments when you can maybe veer from what I've written or what I'm suggesting by giving sensory cues, by giving, options of variations, by saying, oh, this is where you can be loose. You can use any other herb if you don't have this one, and it won't make that much of a difference. Or, no, it's absolutely essential. Do not substitute the Parmesan, Yeah.
And so I want to ask you if how did you end up selecting the recipes in your book? But before we go there, just because you just mentioned this, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, and you encourage that.
Yeah.
But when you're experimenting with someone, I think there's an expectation that you're going to fail, even though when you do, quote, quote, fail, you're still shocked by your failure, right? So when you're trying new things, most of the time, you have no idea what's going to happen, even though you have a recipe right in front of you. So do you find joy in that process or inspiration from that process? Or maybe it's a little bit of a frustrated joy?
Oh, I would say it's both. I think it just depends the mindset I'm in. So sometimes I assume that I have to nail it the first time, and that's when I inevitably am going to be disappointed. And often it's because I've put some sort of time pressure on myself or some other pressure to deliver big the first time.
Right.
But when I am able to approach it with open-mindedness and a sense of curiosity, I think that's when sort of I'm able to actually see what is special or good that I can then take, instead of feeling like the whole thing is a failure. So an example, and this actually answers your question about how I decided certain things to keep and leave out, was here, let's talk about chocolate chip cookies, which is everyone, there's,
Classic.
There's so many, and there's endless sort of variations on the chocolate chip cookie recipe. And I've always believed that the Toll House recipe is just a pretty freaking great recipe. And so to me, if you are going to give me a chocolate chip cookie recipe and it's not going to produce cookies that are better than a Toll House, then I don't want to do it, because often there are extra steps, or you have to do different kinds of flour. And so it's not that I'm not willing to do more, but the more better, deliver more. And so somehow I got it in my head to include a chocolate chip cookie recipe. And I was like, well, I'm just going to take the whole, I'm going to do brown butter, and I'm going to do all these things. And I learned this. It all started because I learned this really cool trick about dry milk powder. So dry milk powder is just the milk solids from milk, and which is basically just protein. So when we're making brown butter, which is delicious and has that nutty flavor, and now brown butter chocolate cookies are kind of everywhere.
I can smell it already.
It's kind of like hazelnut smelly. So brown butter is so good in a chocolate chip cookie, but the part that's the like magical caramely nutty part is the milk solids that have browned in the pan. So what if you could get more of that in your cookie without having to increase the butter? Because if you increase the butter, the ratios of the butter and the flour go off. So the way to do that, I learned, is by adding some non-fat milk powder into your brown butter when you're browning it. So you're just bumping up your brown butter per se. Yeah, right? You're going to get more of that caramely goodness. So I was like, I'm a genius. This is not to say, I know there are plenty of people who've done this before me, but it was a very exciting thing to me. And I was like, I can share this with people. So then I started working on a chocolate chip cookie recipe. I made so many chocolate chip cookies. And in the end, it even got to the point where we photographed them for the book. And again, chocolate chip cookies have been photographed every way from here to eternity. There's not something like really special and new
but
about
them. But it's not your chocolate chip.
But they're not mine. And so in the end, I ended up cutting it because I just was waffling so hard. And I was like, if I can't stand up to my own criticism, then I can't expect other people to go with this. And what's interesting is right now, actually, just today, I was talking to my recipe tester, because I was like, I'm not giving up. I know there's a way we can still make it better. So we're still working on it. Like, I have a dream.
So are you telling me your next book is going to be the 30 different chocolate chip recipes?
Totally.
I think we will all be jumping on that. And I think we're all running to put the milk powder onto our list.
Yeah.
Well, and then I want to talk about ingredients.
Yeah.
Because so that's a new one or at least for me, it's going to be a new one to add to my list is, what's one ingredient that you wish everyone had on hand?
Oh man. Wow, this is like I feel so much pressure right now.
I know, it's like asking what's your favorite book,
I know.
And suddenly you're like, I never read.
I will say, okay, this is a real simple one, and it's in some ways just been a revelation to me in a belated way in my cooking career, but for some people they're going to be like, duh, which is seasoned rice vinegar. So, so rice vinegar is like a common ingredient in a lot of Asian cuisines, and the seasoned rice vinegar just means that they've put a little bit of salt and sugar in it. And so it's a very light tasting vinegar. And it's, when I first sort of learned about it, because I was trained in sort of Western European cooking, and then I had my own sort of Iranian, like sort of culinary expertise that I brought into that. But I am less familiar as a cook with Asian cuisines. And so seasoned rice vinegar was not something I was like using or buying. I didn't know the difference between unseasoned and seasoned. And then at some point I realized, oh my God, there's salt and sugar in this. It's what makes it's, a lot of times I think sushi rice is seasoned with seasoned rice vinegar. And so it has this little tang, but a little bit of sweetness. It's so delicious. So because it's quite a neutral vinegar, it's become my go-to. It's the one I reach for every time. So when I don't feel like making a salad dressing from scratch, or when I have not made one, or I'm just feeling lazy, I literally just sprinkle a little bit of rice vinegar and olive oil over my lettuces, and that becomes the tastiest salad dressing because it's already got like 3 of the tastes in there. It has acid, salt, and sugar, and so it's just like it makes everything better. It's so good.
I feel like it tastes really clean.
It tastes
too,
very clean.
so you don't feel bad about yourself.
Yeah. Well, there's no reason there's no reason to feel
No.
bad. But like, it's nice too because of that. Like the word that I would use is clean or neutral. Like I agree, it tastes very clean and neutral. And so a lot of times the base ingredients that we choose in our cooking, be it the cooking oils or the vinegars or cheeses or things like that, they will, even if you're not thinking about it, they will direct the flavor of a dish toward a particular culture. And so if you're using olive oil, but you're trying to make Taiwanese food, your food's never going to taste right because there's no olive trees in Taiwan.
Right. That I know of.
And so that we know of. And so olive oil is not a classic Taiwanese cooking oil. And so, but what I love about the rice vinegar is that even though it is sort of more traditional to Asian cultures and Asian cuisines, because it is so neutral tasting and so clean tasting, it wouldn't necessarily make something that I was trying to make taste Italian. It wouldn't taste quote unquote wrong.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, with the quote unquote wrong, especially with your new book, Good Things, Recipes and Rituals to Share with People You Love, you go around the world, really, the recipes. And why was that important for you to be able to explore that?
I feel like the world, like the food is the best part of the world, you know, like
the universal language.
Yeah. And it is, there are so many delicious things that I have, been exposed to just whether by sort of physically traveling to a place or by, traveling through a cookbook and or going to a restaurant and eating their food. And so for me, I kind of feel like I'm a little, I don't know, a magpie or something, collecting like all of the little delicious things in my life. And all I ever want to do when I find something really good is share it with people. And so I'm like, oh my God, did you know this?
Right.
Like that's the sentiment of this book is like, oh my God, like these are the things I've collected. And so they're not just from one place. They're from sort of my broad experience in life. And sometimes it is a little bit of like taking something, one example is sort of there's a chapter that begins the book that's kind of these like pantry items that you can make to sort of then use to as condiments or use to build other dishes on. So whether it's things like having a jar in your pantry of shallots that you fried that then you can sprinkle on top of a soup or a rice, or making a Calabrian chili crisp, or having a green salsa or a herb de labneh. And so one of these components is it's a preserved lemon paste. And so preserved lemons are like a traditional sort of ingredient in North African cuisines. And that was how I learned about them. And because I live in California and there's citrus trees everywhere, a thing I was taught to do as a young cook was to make my own preserved Meyer lemons, which is very simple. You just salt lemons and you leave them on the counter for 3 weeks until they're really cured and quite fermented. And then you transition it to the fridge. And then when you're making a tagine or a Moroccan-inspired thing, you can add these lemons into the dish. But the truth of the matter was, like, as much as I loved making the preserved lemons, I was not very good at using them up because I'm not making that many tagines in my daily life. Right. And so I often would be like, why did I do this? And then they kind of sit there and turn gray over time, and it's just less appetizing, and they start to taste a little bit metallic, and I don't know.
And now you're sad.
And then you're sad. And so one day my friend, Chris Crawford, has a vinegar and fermentation company, and she has sent me something to try, and it was a jar of pureed lemon paste. So she had just literally taken the lemons and then pureed them once they were preserved. And I realized, oh, of course, like you can take this puree and add a spoonful of it to so many different things and get this kind of wonderful kick of like salt and lemon and umami, and I can stir it into my yogurt. Recently, I made a soda. Like I just stirred a little bit of the puree into fizzy water and a little bit of agave syrup. It was like a salty lemon soda that was so good.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, or like I made frozen yogurt where I stirred some of the paste into yogurt and froze it. That was delicious. But also you can add it to vinaigrettes or braises or soups or like salad dressings, anything. And the one thing then, when I was making it, I was like, oh, what if I added a little bit of fresh turmeric root into my jar of lemons, and then when I puree it, the whole thing becomes this incredible sunny yellow lemon color, sunny lemon yellow color. And so instead of sort of sitting in the fridge and like turning gray and sad over the course of the year, every time I open the fridge now, there's this like beautiful, like, canary yellow paste. And I'm so excited to use it. And because of that, I've come up with even more things to do with it. Like we made a preserved lemon cake that's so delicious.
I feel like there's some sort of metaphor there.
For sure.
Well, and it sounds like too, where I think you have favorite good things to put on everything, and that seems like that's one of
That's
them.
one of what's funny is my relationship to the lemon paste really has like developed since I finished the book. And so many of my ideas are post book because I keep using it. Like that's the other thing I really feel about the book is that it is a very accurate sort of portrait of my life in this moment. It's a document about like who I am. It's, pictures of my actual home, my actual stuff, the food we actually eat and cook, the recipes that I really make and share on a daily basis. And that's why almost none of them are like project cooking. There's a small handful of things that might take a whole day or a whole afternoon, but almost everything else is just something that I make because I had this laying around, and I feel like that is what I sort of came to realize, going back to what I was saying before about trying to be a little bit nicer to myself or not beat myself up as much. It's a little bit of like, well, if I find pleasure in these small things, like maybe you will too. So like, instead of like spending my time trying to control and worry about what you're going to do with these recipes or this book once I give it to you, if I shift my approach and think of it instead of as like a gift that I'm offering you in sort of my cupped palm, then it's up to you what to do with it, what you will like, and you can take from it what serves you and leave the rest behind. And that was sort of how I got to a place where I was like, felt like I could give it,
Well, I feel like this kind of goes back to the feedback that you were saying earlier when you're hearing from people like, oh, I make your recipes every week, or we use this for a party. And you already answered this question in some ways, but clearly it's so intentional in terms of you really encourage people to use ingredients that are in their pantries.
Yeah.
They're not super duper complicated. I think we get it. Well, we get it into our heads that
we all do.
If it's a recipe, then it's a lot of ingredients. It's very complicated. It's going to take a whole day. But I think what really resonates with both of your books is we can all do it.
Yeah, that's very much at the heart of it is. And I think really hard about that when choosing the recipes and the ingredients in the recipes is I am very aware that I live sort of in the like agricultural haven of the Bay Area, and that there's so much available to me pretty much year round. But I always try to place myself outside of that when I'm shopping for the ingredients to test with, when I'm choosing, how many steps to ask you to do, because I am very aware, like, as a person who's also followed recipes in other books for 20 something years, like I've had my own experience of being like, oh, I'm really excited. I'm going to try and make this thing. Oh, I have to make 2 special trips to specialty stores to get those things.
Right.
And then I have to spend a whole afternoon making it. And then you do it and it's not that good. And that's a real disappointment and like I feel betrayed and angry sometimes. And so I don't want to cause that feeling in anyone. So I will say it's not that I have no obscure things, but if I'm going to ask you to do it, there's a reason why, and I'm going to tell you the reason why, and also give you the option to leave that out if you want.
Right.
And
it's
so,
probably not only for that one recipe.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, and so you're coming to us at the cusp of fall, I think, in Connecticut. It feels crazy because it's still summer.
It's
technically.
so warm, but yeah.
But
but in a few days it'll be fall. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, do you have any favorite soups or favorite fall foods that you think our listeners should check out?
Oh yeah, I mean, so I will say I do love winter squash a lot.
Same.
And I love it a lot more at the beginning of the fall than at the end. When it's still new.
Okay, so we are going to need an early fall soup or an early winter soup and a later winter soup.
Okay, great. And so there's a recipe in the book that I make it's a newer breed of squash called sometimes honey nut. And sometimes it's called 8-8 squash. And it was developed in sort of concert between a chef named Dan Barber in New York and the farmers he works with, who grew, basically Dan Barber at some point was interacting with a farmer and was like, I think the farmer was lamenting how much water it takes to grow a squash. And Dan Barber was like, that's crazy, because the first thing a chef does when he gets a squash in the kitchen is cook all the water out. You want to roast the heck out of it to get it all caramelized and sweet. So what if there were a way to grow a less watery squash it makes the whole process more efficient, right? And so you've probably seen them. They're like these, they almost look like miniature butternut squashes. And so they're more widely available these days. They're maybe about 10 years old. They're like, so they've kind of infiltrated into the market. So I love them because they're so concentrated in sweetness and in flavor. And truly, I just have them and roast them sort of skin side up. And then you can like, or maybe even peel them and roast them in pieces. And then I would love making like any sort of, like I call it a salad, but it's really a side dish of roasted vegetables that's like served at room temperature. And from there, now you can build on this thing. So you have this like caramelized sweet butternut squash or honey nut squash. And so what's going to heighten that is a little bit of acid. So you could put some pickled onions on there. You could put any fresh herb to sort of perk up all of that dark, heavy caramelization. You could drizzle it with a little maple syrup if you wanted, or chili crisp would be a great topping. So that's kind of like, and there's a whole rubric in the book for making all these types of side dishes. And I think butternut squash or carrots also make a delicious soup. And there's a good recipe in the book for like a curried carrot soup. And there's a squash variation too that's super simple. And you just sort of basically dump everything in a pot. And when it's soft, you puree it. And that kind of thing is just like so simple and so warming and really nice.
I'm a huge what's in the fridge, just dump it all in a pot type of person.
Yeah.
So that's perfect for me. More with author and cook Samin Nosrat after a short break. Her new book is Good Things, Recipes and Rituals to Share with People You Love. You can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're speaking with James Beard Award-winning author Samin Nosrat. You might know her from the best-selling cookbook, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Her new book is Good Things, Recipes and Rituals to Share with People You Love. It's a collection of recipes and essays that might just inspire you to gather with those people you love to share a meal with, or perhaps even start a ritual. So rituals, huge theme in your new book, Samin. What was the process like building your own sort of dinner party or dinner rituals with the people you love?
It definitely happened sort of by mistake, or
As
maybe
most
not.
great things do.
Maybe not mistake, but let's say serendipitously. I would not say it was some like great intention, even though for many years I did have my own dream of creating a weekly dinner ritual inspired by some that I sort of participated in with other friends when I traveled. But my life was, I was traveling so much. I also really had this excuse that I felt was kind of hypocritical, which I believed. I was like, oh, I could never do that because I don't have a place for anyone to sit, because I lived in a really little apartment and I was like, what, I'm going to make them sit on the ground next to my coffee table? Even though I would always tell people like, it doesn't matter. People can sit on a couch. It doesn't. Yeah. And so I kind of had this whole list of excuses. One of them also was, I think the classic night for this type of gathering is Sunday. People always talk about a Sunday dinner.
Right.
And I thought about my own life, and most of my friends are parents of small children. And so thinking like, could I actually get people to commit to coming over week after week on a Sunday evening when like with their kids, when like that seems impossible. Getting people to put their kids in a car, come over with or without food. Like it just, anything with kids on a Sunday before school night feels like a big ask. And so I had a lot of doubt about it, and I was really sad. And that was honestly something I really felt in that loneliness that I was talking about, that like sense of loneliness that I had, that I've like done all this work, I've achieved all this stuff, and now I'm sitting here and there's nobody to share it with. So I really wanted a dinner ritual. I just didn't know how to go about making it happen. And then one day I was testing a recipe for I was trying to make like pork al pastor, which is a complicated street food that I was trying to sort of adapt for making at home, which maybe was not the greatest idea. And so I kept failing. And every time I failed, each time I'd make this like 4 or 6 pound pork shoulder.
Right.
So then I had all of this pork I had to eat. So my friend came over right in the midst of one of these trials, and she saw that I was really like down on myself, and she's like, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, like not only is this going to be horrible and not work, but then I'm going to have to eat it for the next 27 meals by myself." And she was like, "Oh, we'll help you eat it. You can bring it over to us." And this was sort of in the like post-vaccine era where I was just sort of starting to think about, oh, I can go over to people's houses again. So it felt in some ways like a lifeline. I was like, really? When can I come?
Right. You got to thank the pork.
Yeah. And so she said, just come on Tuesday. And so I like packed up the pork and I came on Tuesday and we shredded it and we made perfectly good tacos. They were not the thing I had imagined, but it kind of didn't matter. It was just like a very good meal with our kids and our other friends who sort of live in the backyard. And it was so nice and natural that we were like, oh, well, should we just do this again next week? So we kept doing it. And this group of friends, I want to stress, was not like if you had given me a piece of paper and said, write down the people you want to create a dinner ritual with, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of these folks. They're my friends. I've known them for a long time, but they were not like my innermost circle by any means. But what's happened now, that's been almost 5 years, I think it'll be, I guess we're going on close to 5 years with these dinners, is that they have become my closest family. They have become at the center of my life. And this Monday dinner, we always sort of jokingly say is like our religion or it's church. And in fact, we just had our first book events like right before I left home last week, and the kids came and afterward they were texting me and they were saying like, oh, wow, like I get it. Like, 42 isn't the meaning of life. Monday dinner is the meaning of life. And to see kids like really sort of understand and look forward to this thing is so special. And it's not, again, I want to be clear, like, sure, some of the time I was testing recipes or I'll cook something that I'm so excited to cook and bring it over. But I definitely don't do everything. I don't determine the menu on my own. We all do it together. Sometimes I don't even make anything. And I think that has given me a whole new understanding of what it means to like be like of hospitality, what it means to be generous, how to accept generosity, how it is to be part of something, and how it is to like create something together. And that has been like such a gift to me in my life.
When I was going to say, following the theme of 42, I think don't panic is another one for what we're talking about today, especially when you're talking about not like you're making a meal for everybody, but then there's a sense of consistency and communication. Everyone has to kind of be on the same page in order to do this, right? And so I think for many of us, as you mentioned earlier, everyone's busy. Everyone's living their lives. And so it's really hard to get anyone together and fit everyone into a schedule. So I think you kind of touched on this in some way, but for our listeners that might want to try this out with their friend group, where should they start? Because it doesn't have to be anything big.
No, it doesn't have to be anything big. And I've thought a lot about this over the years, and I did put a rubric in the book for like how to create your own, because I do think we sort of accidentally stumbled into some things that have made it a lot easier for us that seem a little bit unconventional. So I think when people think of, oh, let's start a group meal, a lot of times they're like, well, it should be a potluck and we should share the responsibility of hosting. And I would not call what we do a potluck at all. And even more importantly, it has always been in the same house on the same day at the same time. And because of that, there is so much less that we have to communicate about. There's not the sort of, you don't have to do a spreadsheet. You don't have to do a doodle poll. You don't have to figure out when people are available. We all know that Mondays are holy for us, and that is sort of cleared on our schedules. It's in our Google Calendar. And so because of that, then everyone is committed. And so I think having full buy-in from everyone is really important. And I think also just reducing the amount of variables. And because of that, then that allows us, if somebody has a surplus of something, then they make all of the soup for us that week or whatever. And so really the communication on the text thread is almost entirely about fun stuff. It's about what are we going to have? Who's going to come join us at the table? What fun thing is happening this week? Instead of like, does so-and-so have mayonnaise or whatever? Like there's so much less of that. And so, yeah, and because it's in the same house, now we all are familiar with that kitchen. We're familiar with the place. And we've been able to create sort of like a lot of things to look forward to, which I also think is really key. I think if you think of this as something you have to do and a chore, it's not going to work. It has to feel like a gift. And so however that is for you, however you can make it feel special and something to look forward to is really important. So, you know, for us, like we're all big gardeners. And so we'll send the kids out into the yard to make a flower display or just a vase of flowers, you know, or maybe your thing is music and you've made a special playlist that you play every week. Or maybe like you're a big wine person and you've been saving all these fancy wines and like, why save them? Like start drinking them, you know, or whatever. But if each time is an opportunity to look forward to rather than a chore you have to get through, I think that is really crucial. And a lot of the things that I sort of read about ritual and came to understand about ritual and understood that we had sort of accidentally stumbled into are based on sort of the scaffolding that a lot of the time religion will give us, right? Religion, one of the beautiful things of religion is that it creates a community where there is full buy-in. And so if, you know, everyone knows they have to go to the temple of worship on Friday or Saturday or Sunday. And so there's not a convincing because you just understand that's part of your week. And so in that way, I think we sort of have created that for ourselves.
Well, and I think it's amazing that the buy-in is also everyone with their children. And that's one of our favorite things actually about your new book. And it made me kind of, I was trying to remember, you know, way back when I was a kid, I don't think I was ever not invited to like an adult gathering, right? Like, I mean, there might be like the kids table, but that's fair, right? So I was always in that environment where it was welcomed, and it seems like this is the case because it's not the case for a lot of people, right? Or institutions.
Or I guess like dinner party. You're right. Yeah, there is a lot of leaving out of kids, but to me, one of the joys is like, for one thing, it's sometimes a drag. I won't be wrong. Like I have to I love spicy food and I have to always sort of like hold back the spice because of the kids.
Right. I did witness one of our friends' kids who had no idea what he was eating, and then it was too late. He was crying.
Oh no.
So sad, but kind of funny, but
that
so
is
sad.
Kind of funny, yeah. But you know, one of the beauties of children is that they are like ruthlessly honest.
Right.
And so for me as a person, who, like I'm constantly sort of looking for feedback because I want to know how I can make stuff better.
Well, you're going to get that.
Yeah, kids will always give that to you. But sometimes you're like, come on, like you ate chicken enchiladas last week. Why are you not liking them this week? Like, so it's just, I think it's a very good reminder that like that this whole thing is an experiment and it's a living experiment. And so that I think is another part of what makes it crucial to have the like full buy-in and the consistency, because that way, like if one of the dinners is a bust or a kid throws a tantrum or this week they're like, I'm now a vegetarian, I don't eat whatever, and you've like shown up with a roast chicken, there's kind of the pressure's not as high to have a great night or to have a great meal because you know that there's next week. Whereas I think in our very busy lives, when we have created this thing where you decide in 4.5 weeks that your friends are going to get together and everyone's going to cook, there's so much pressure for that night to deliver, you know, socially, sort of connectively, like maybe culinarily. And that's a lot of pressure to put on one evening, especially if there's kids there, especially if like just we all have feelings. Everyone has feelings.
And sometimes those feelings are big.
Yeah, totally. And so I think having the consistency means it's okay. It's okay. Like it's okay if this one's a bust. And sometimes they're a bust. Like,
what does it mean for you to be able to find that? Especially, Adult Samin looking back at maybe kids Samin when you felt lonely. I mean, even when you were an adult, you felt lonely.
Yeah.
But now that you found your community, and I hope that it's continuing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I'm missing a few for this tour, but I get the updates. I'm like, I find
Right.
out. I know what they're all eating. No, and I'm so happy to have this thing that I get to be a part of and get to celebrate and get to sort of feel like I have a home to return to. And I will say, like, I did not approach this book tour without a fair amount of anxiety, in large part because the last time I sort of returned home with my life sort of turned upside down. And the other day, as I was leaving my house to sort of embark on the first stop, I closed the door and I like said a little prayer to myself. I was like, okay, it's going to be different this time. And I really do think like I have done a lot of work in my life to create something that I'm grounded in and rooted in. And that, I have this home now that's part of this little community. I have this amazing group of people I have dinner with every week. I have, my dog and my girlfriend. Like I just have other things other than work that are propelling me in life. And I think that is so helpful.
Well, and I think we live in a world where we're very much reliant on certain labels, or our personalities are revolved around the work that we do or the hobbies that we like. Is it refreshing that perhaps in some ways, I mean, this is very much a part of you, of course, cooking and food and whatnot, but are you able to sort of shed that for a second?
I am very much trying to. And I think sometimes to some people's chagrin, because they expect me to show up and be the food person.
Right.
And now I'm like, but I just want to talk about feelings and kids, And so it feels in some ways like a great burden lifted from me for sure to have to, I also, there are a million other things I love, and I want to be able to have room to explore those and talk about those and share those too.
Well, then we've been talking a lot about perfectionism too. And so whether or not you're cooking for a group or for yourself, we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves, regardless of what the project is, right? You want the dishes to be right and perfect. What are some ways that recovering perfectionists can just let go and just enjoy being in the moment and enjoying that very simple, delicious food?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything. So I would 100% call myself a recovering and sometimes not recovering perfectionist. But and certainly in terms of like hosting or cooking for people, I've always sort of historically had this idea that I have to do everything, take care of everything, make sure everyone is happy, not let anyone do anything. And, often that ends up with me being this like kind of whirling dervish in the house while everyone else, and I'm like, no, don't get up. Like you sit down and enjoy, but I'm just going to be a chaotic Tasmanian devil, like washing all the dishes while you're 4 feet away or something, And so this pressure that I have entirely put on myself to do everything. And then I get resentful and become like martyr complex. And so that's no good. And I think I've realized in a big way, actually being part of Monday Dinner where I'm not able, like, it's not my house. I'm not the host. I am not responsible for everything. It's taught me a lot about sort of, actually, it's much more generous to be present at the table with people. And frankly, that's all we ever really want from anyone is someone's time and focus and attention. And so if I'm like insisting that I'm washing the dishes right now or getting up and doing 900 things, like I'm not at the dinner with you. And there's a sadness, there's a loneliness that I was often left with in the wake of dinner when people would come over, because I'd be like, I didn't even experience that. And I didn't realize like I was doing it to myself. So a big thing that I do now is I've just lowered all my expectations and standards.
That's a great way to do it.
And truly, especially when it comes to people coming over, I just make much simpler things that can as much as possible be made in advance and either heated or not heated and served. And so truly it's stuff like barely marinated, gently warmed olives, a bowl of popcorn. Yeah.
We love a bowl of popcorn. Yeah.
Like, other things that, just room temperature roasted vegetables, like a simple one pot pasta, that kind of stuff, which is just as like truly just as comforting and nourishing to eat as anything more grandiose. And also, as I reflect upon sort of a lifetime of dinners at tables, very rarely do I remember the things that I ate. Right. Almost always do I remember sort of what was happening, who was there, they were making fun of me for being dense or whatever,
Sure.
you know,
Right.
like,
It's
and
the,
so,
it's the memories.
yeah.
It's the experience.
yeah.
So it sounds like keeping it simple is a good way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate your time, focus, and attention.
Oh,
and
thank
the
you.
generosity of your storytelling with
Thank
us
you.
today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, you've been listening to Samin Nosrat. She's a cook, teacher, and author of the James Beard Award-winning book, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And her new book is Good Things, Recipes and Rituals to Share with People You Love. Listeners can find our full conversation with her on ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening, and happy cooking and happy eating, everyone.
Yeah.